Hi, welcome to part two. Now let me be very truthful about part two. Part two covers objective 2 and objective 3, which is issues related to ownership and how it's largely been separated from managerial control in the modern corporation and how it creates agency issues. You will have talked about agency issues in other classes from a non-strategic perspective. You may have talked about it in other classes, particularly accounting classes, from a board governance or accounting auditing committee governance perspective. We're talking about it from a strategic perspective. And even though what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes in these two objectives is interesting and a little bit exciting and really factual type information, really the key issues, I can't communicate to you the richness of this area by me just talking about it. So what I've done is I've added multiple videos about ownership and the growth of the modern corporation and the agency relationship and problems in the agency relationship to give you a more holistic perspective of these issues. So even though you really need to know the core facts I'm giving you, the core concepts I'm giving you in these first two issues, it's important to immerse yourself in those other videos to enable you to get a holistic understanding about why this area is important. So, why is ownership being largely separated from managerial control in the modern corporation? Well, it's the evolution of the modern corporation that has occurred since its establishment. Since the modern corporation was established, almost as an individual person, and in some countries it's defined as an individual person, that can own and control and be sued and can separate the risk to an extent in a limited liability corporation from the owners being directly responsible for some of the behaviours or for all the financial risks through a limited liability structure, that we've seen this separation. Modern corporation separates ownership and management control. Shareholders and managers have become specialised. Shareholders are the owners of the company. They're the people that can purchase shares. That entitles them to an income, the residual returns on the organisation over its operations after all the expenses have been paid. And in fact, if the organisation is wrapped up, it gets the residual. If it's sold, you purchase components of that. This specialisation comes about because owners can choose where to invest, but may not have the expertise to run the organisation. Or as organisations become larger and more complex, do not have the ability or the scope to be able to do everything themselves. This separation of ownership and control creates an agency relationship, and that agency relationship contributes to the need for corporate governance. The agency relationship exists when one or more people, the principals, the owners, hire another person, the agent or agents, to make decisions or implement operations for the owners, the principals. So, in the case of hiring managers, you are hiring people that are decision-making specialists that have expertise in a particular area or areas to perform the service of making those decisions on behalf of the owners. Another COVID cough. The principals of the company delegate decision-making responsibility to the agent, the managers. The agency relationship is related, therefore, to how the firm's strategies are implemented. But it becomes a little bit more complex than that because frequently the managers are also on the board of directors in some way. And sometimes particular managers may also be owners. And then as we expand from those areas of corporate governance, there are also responsibilities that managers have not only to the owners, but also to, say, a professional body or a regulatory body. When you see, at the moment we have all these vaccines being developed, and we're seeing pharmaceutical companies being interviews. And frequently you'll see the principal, the CEO, saying something positive about what's happening. You'll also see somebody called the Chief Medical Officer. That Chief Medical Officer has particular responsibilities to the owners of the company, to the board of directors, as the representatives of the owners, but also has responsibilities to regulatory bodies, because their expertise is about the ethical development and scientific processes related to developing this drug. Now, the reason I picked, or this vaccine, the reason I picked that was because most of us are familiar with people who are CFOs or CIOs, but it extends beyond those type of corporate roles to specific professional managerial decision-making roles related to areas of expertise. Most of the focus on the agency relationship in strategy looks at the relationship between the owners and the top management team. The nature of the top management team includes almost always people like the CEO and the CFO and the Chief Operating Officer, all of which may be called something different depending on the country that you're operating in. Managing Director is used quite frequently in the UK and Australia. President is used quite often in the US and other countries. So those roles, but it also includes other specialist roles in the top management team. So when you have that separation between the managers and the owners, clearly you can have some issues related to the strategic direction of the firm. Remember when we talked about diversification a few weeks ago? How many weeks ago? About 4 weeks ago. And we talked about the motives for diversifying in corporate level strategy. And we said that some of the motives for diversifying were value creating. Some of the motivations for diversifying were value neutral. And some could have a negative impact on those values. Frequently, the negative ones that have the negative impact are about managers putting their needs or their objectives above, or their compensation requirements above the objectives, the goals of the organisation. And sometimes that can apply to the manager neutral as well. Now, let me be very clear. We're not talking about managers where we are not for the purpose of opportunism. We're talking about in an agency relationship that managers should be implementing these strategies on behalf of the board. They may influence the board, but they should be implementing those strategies on behalf of the board or on behalf of the owners, the principals, the owners of the company. And if they are and it doesn't work, well, that's not an agency relationship issue. That's a strategy issue, whether the strategy was appropriate or whether the manager was effectively implementing the strategy. But the agency relationship and managerial opportunism is when the manager's interests do not match the owner's interests and the manager's interests are being implemented. So here's a picture of the agency relationship. Firm owners, managers and agents as the decision making. The agency relationship is that the owners bear the risk and the managers receive compensation as decision making specialists. Now, we've all looked in other courses at how those things may or may not apply. We all read in the business media where managers' compensation is linked to particular performance levels, or where managers are both managers and owners, which makes the agency relationship even more complex. The principal and the agent often have different interests, and separation of ownership and control provides that potential for divergent interests to surface, to there being a conflict between those interests. Shareholders lack direct control in large publicly traded corporations, and problems can arise when the agent makes decisions resulting in the pursuit of goals that are in conflict with those of the principal. Now, when we talked about diversification in corporate level strategy, we mentioned things like, well, managers get greater compensation and lower employment risk if they're in a large diversified organisation, because if one part's performing and other parts not. It sort of hides that level of performance. And also the larger and more diversified the organisation, the higher the managerial compensation appears. And for future employment risk, if you are the manager of a diverse organisation and you do want to leave, because you have experience or can claim experience across different areas, it increases the potential employers for your expertise. The principle is now let's look at the problems of the agency relationship. This is what should happen. The principle establishes governance and control mechanism, and the manager follows those governance and control mechanisms so that what their behaviour is aligned to the objectives of the organisation. Their decision-making services are aligned to the objectives of the organisation, serving the principal, not serving themselves. But it can be quite difficult or expensive for the principal to verify that the agent has behaved appropriately. They may have more information. They often have more information than the owners because they're the ones running the firm day to day. And in fact, the owners have given them that responsibility. Remember when we talked about Wesfarmers a few weeks ago? And when we talked about Wesfarmers' corporate level strategy, we were saying, well, it looks as if in their corporate strategy that the people who invest in Wesfarmers are investing in Wesfarmers because they believe the managers have the ability to pick winners, develop winners and sell them off. Grow the business, manage the company. So what is effectively is doing that the owners of the investors in Wesfarmers are saying, gee, Wesfarmers can select businesses better than we can select businesses, and Wesfarmers can Wesfarmers management, and Wesfarmers management can identify and control and develop businesses, so we should just hand that over to them. They're not active shareholders. They're not going saying, well, we're going to invest in a retail store, or we're going to invest in the owner. We're going to invest in all these different companies. We're going to invest in one company and let them do that investment for us. So, back to this focused topic of the problem with agency relationships. The agent can exercise managerial opportunism. Oh, look, there's that famous story of a CEO, a salaried CEO in a large manufacturing and retail business in the US, who for some reason bought a agribusiness in the Caribbean and Central America. Now, why was that? When you looked and explored it, you would find that if you were an owner of the business and the CEO, right, you're likely to have a private jet. But then you looked at people who, possibly a private air fleet. When you looked at other corporations, quite frequently that didn't occur when there was a separation between the owners, the really rich, and the CEOs, just the rich. They often didn't have things like private jets. However, because of the nature of agribusiness and in the Caribbean, of course there would be private jets, because so the company was being bought so that the CEO could gain access to a private jet fleet. Therefore, move up his own status to being equivalent to other CEOs in his industry. Now, I deliberately haven't named the company, but you could probably work out it's not one of the companies like Walmart, because the Walton family would have their own private jets and they own Walmart. And it's not the type of company that's News Corp, because the senior people in News Corp have their own private jets because it's a significant family ownership, right? It's one of those companies that is owned by a famous family, but run by somebody else. So, and you will find in some of the videos, there are allusions made to that example without naming the company. As well, because it's one of those famous examples that show managerial opportunism as at its highest level. Well, maybe not as its highest level, but maybe at its most meaningless, most unaligned to corporate objectives. Managerial opportunism prevents the maximisation of shareholder wealth. So, We are not talking about things that may detract from shareholder wealth because they're compliance with legislation or in line with the objectives that the owners have set that end up not maximising wealth for the shareholder. We're talking about something the manager does that does not align with the objectives of maximising shareholder worth. Shareholders prefer to reduce risks by holding a diversified portfolio of equity investment. That's why I raised the Wesfarmers example, because Wesfarmers is a company that has that diverse portfolio of investments. So some shareholders are saying, well, we're going to invest in Wesfarmers because we can move that because they'll run a diversified business better than we can. They'll select winners better than we can. But any principal can decide to invest in different companies, make different equity investors. So the argument for diversification in an unrelated way only survives in companies where the expertise is about a treasury function or their ability to pick winners better. In most cases, diversification doesn't add value unless it's related or related linked diversifications. Executives may prefer a level of diversification that maximises firm size because it maximises their compensation and reduces their employment risk. Looping back to what I said earlier. So there's actually a sweet spot in the level of diversification where risk for shareholders and risk for managers is lowest, but the risk for the shareholders are lowest where there's a dominant business or related constrained diversification, and risk for the managerials, this is the employment risk profile, risk is lowest when somewhere between related link and unrelated businesses. So you can see that just in a risk profile, there is a significant difference between managerial and shareholder risks in terms of where they set on diversification. And somewhere between related constraint and related linked is the balance between those two things. But the balance between those two things is irrelevant if you're following pure agency theory that says that the shareholder risk profile is what you need to focus on. The only reason it would fit in here is if you had significant family ownership and the other shareholders agreed, or in the case of some company like Wesfarmers, that you have investors who are investing because they are seeking the expertise of Wesfarmers in their ability to select and evolve and pick winners and manage businesses and their track record of taking over businesses and fixing them and selling them off. So we're going to move on in a minute to the governance mechanisms. But to do that, before we do that, there's a number of videos I want you to watch which explain the history of corporations and show you some of the agency risk and define agency theory and talk a little bit about that governance. But I think it's important to add, before we look at the actual internal mechanisms and external mechanism, because we're only going to look at one external mechanism, is that we focus on a definition of agency cost. Because agency cost, which is what we're talking about here, links to those governance mechanisms, how well they're applied, and influences whether or not they are the most appropriate mechanism to use. So agency costs are the sum of incentive costs, monitoring costs, enforcement costs, and individual financial losses incurred by the principals in implementing governance. They arise because it's impossible to use governance mechanisms to guarantee total compliance by the agent. And however, boards of directors do have a fiduciary or financial responsibility to shareholders to monitor the management. But there are issues about whether boards of directors can actually do that effectively. So the methods that we're going to talk about, the internal methods, including the board of directors method, and the external method, are things that impact on, or methods you can use, mechanisms you can use to monitor governance. But they all have their strengths and weaknesses related to costs and incentives, which is why that sometimes they are chosen appropriately, or sometimes there are inappropriate reasons for them not to be chosen. Okay, so there's some videos to watch that give you some idea about the areas we've just spoken about in Objective 1 and 2 and 3. And then we're going to look at the mechanisms after you've seen those videos.